So Emil would have hated this. Or rather, he would have simply objected. He objected strenuously to what he called this cult of personality. I think it stemmed from his feelings that while some accomplishments are noteworthy, people are inherently equal, and he resisted being put on a pedestal. In life, for any event honoring him, we had to convince him to participate by an appeal to the idea that it was not really for him, it was for the rest of us. And so it is today. The workshop and this memorial are not for him, they're for us, as we wonder what could possibly fill an Emil Wolf-sized hole in the universe.
And I had a great pleasure to work with Emil when I was a director here. Even our overlap with Emil was not as extended as many of my colleagues, but I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to meet with him and to talk to him in a different occasion or events. Emil even sent me his book and signed with his name and passed that book to me a couple of years ago. And we are so happy we're able to use the celebration of OSA 100 years anniversary in honor of Emil's contribution 2 years ago. And we have a special oil painting in honor of Emil, as well as we even built a big ice sculpture with a big wolf to show his contribution to the universe as well. So Emil is a legacy of our generation, and actually many of us, including myself and many of our students, benefit greatly through Emil's contribution, and he impacted the entire photonics community as well. Thank you.
Well, I thought I'd just share the moment that I was convinced to work for Emil back in the day. It was 1996, and I was trying to decide what to do with myself. I wasn't quite sure. And Scott Carney, my classmate, actually suggested that I go talk to Emil. And I wasn't really sure because at that point, Emil was 75 years old. And so I went to Emil's office to visit, and Emil was very excited to talk to me. And when I went into the office, Emil started out by saying something along the lines of, the first thing I should tell you is that I'm very old, and I could die at any moment. But, however, my doctor says I'm very healthy and I swim all the time, so I'm pretty sure I'll be around for your full PhD. And then he produced a stack of papers, probably about 2 inches thick, and said, okay, this is your reading for the week, and see if there's anything in there that interests you. So I went home, I looked at the stack of papers, and I realized that this huge, thick stack of papers, which were preprints and reprints, were all from within the past 5 years. And that was the point I was convinced that working with Emil was a reasonable bet, and he was a very enthusiastic person.
Another story, which my wife tells me, so it has to be true. My wife tells me that shortly after we became engaged to be married, I told her, now we have to go see Emil Wolf. She said, why? I said, well, I don't do anything important in life without getting Emil Wolf involved in this decision. I'm happy to report that Emil approved.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to share some of my memories of Emil with you. Many moons ago, when I was a freshly minted PhD, I first came to Rochester to work with Emil. And I expected it to be nice, but it turned out to be 3 times better than that. And let me tell you what our typical day would look like. Every morning we would gather together, and Emil would ask us the same question that Max Born would ask his group. What have you done since yesterday? And that wasn't intimidating, actually, because his enthusiasm was so infectious that usually we had something to say. You had something to report. And those new results would always lead to discussions, right? Now, to say that those discussions were spirited is a euphemism. there would be no, well, maybe that's not really true, or maybe that's not really right. It would be, no, you're completely wrong. And take a piece of chalk in your hand and write something on the whiteboard or the blackboard. And usually, the quickest way of settling an argument was to place a bet. I have made many trips to the local liquor store to buy a bottle of wine for Emil. But I want to say that I loved those discussions. And after those discussions, we would go back to our office and we would all work again. And then it was lunchtime. Now, lunchtime was a big thing for Emil. It was a ritual. We would go to some place off campus usually, and anything less than a full 3-course meal, that didn't count, right? And Emil would out-eat us all. And then, after the bill was settled, we would, pack up and go again, and Emil would insist that we would swing by Dunkin' Donuts. Okay, go back to the office, work again, and then, say, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Emil would stop by again and we would talk shop again. So if you've ever wondered why Emil was so productive, it was because he had this group around him which he inspired, and he showered us with attention and suggestions.
There are many, many stories I can tell, but I think one of the most interesting and humorous is when Emil visited me in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and I worked for Schlumberger, the research labs, and Emil was hired as a consultant. Well, Emil came to the labs, and it was a big, big deal. Everybody wanted to meet him. The director of the research lab wanted to meet him. And we would go out to dinner pretty much every night. People would come. So one night we went out to a restaurant that was known to have a library of books arrayed around all the walls. And Emil and I had gone to that restaurant previously with our wives, and Emil looked at all these books and said, "Look at these books. They buy these books for maybe $1 for all of them. They're cheap, they don't contain any information, they're just for decorations. That's all they are, decorations." So 3 or 4 days later, I got a copy of Born and Wolf, carried it to the restaurant unknown to Emil, and I put it into the bookshelf. 2 nights later, we went to dinner there. And the director of the research was there, Emil, Marlise, myself, my wife, and 3 other researchers. Started to eat dinner. And I said to Emil, "Tell us about these books, Emil." And he goes on and how about these books contain no interesting information. They're just junk, they're decorations. That's when I reached up and pulled down Born and Wolf. And he said, "What, you put that in there?" I said, "No, that's part of the books that you got for $1 for the whole shebang."
The first faculty reception I ever went to, there was dancing. And Emil had not yet been married to Marlise. And so Emil danced with me and with every other woman in the room multiple times. I don't know that anybody else was dancing, but Emil certainly was.
This story dates from about 20 years ago when I first got to know Emil. We were both attending a conference in Albuquerque, and my job every day was to drive Emil back and forth to the conference and to dinner in the evening. So after doing this for a couple of days, Emil said to me, "John, it's a miracle. Have you ever been to Albuquerque before?" I replied, "No, it was my first time." He said, "Well, how is it that you don't get lost?" He said, "That is the definition of an American. Someone who goes to a place they have never been before and never gets lost." Well, I didn't have the heart to tell Emil that in fact the hotel and the conference center were on opposite ends of a very long road, and the restaurant was somewhere in between. Now, there is an important caveat, however, which is that driving with Emil is complicated. It's difficult to pay attention to the road when he's telling you stories, doing cork tricks, and of course, just being Emil.
When I became an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, Emil invited me to Rochester to give a lecture and to meet with the fabulous faculty members here. He and Marlise hosted a dinner where I had the chance to meet the giants in the field, and I know, Brian, you were there at that time. And because I think Emil understood that you can't be one way at work and another way at home. We are all the same person. So getting to know someone person to person was as important as getting to know their work. And Emil coached me, not in pipe smoking, but how to build a body of work to get tenure, how and when to do correspondence. You must keep every letter in a notebook. You must do your correspondence before 10 a.m. Then forget about it. This was prior to email. In short, he taught me how to become a professor.
I must tell you that I worked with him for a long time. Like I was as a PhD student and then about 2 years as a postdoc. And he has been the most wonderful person, greatest, generous, all I can say. But I still don't have the slightest clue that based on what he hired me as a PhD student.
My most memorable moment with Emil was that he was on my defense committee. And at the thesis defense, he first started the conversation with, let's talk about the title. And I thought, oh my goodness, if we're going to worry about the title, does that mean that we're going to have issues worrying about every single little detail in the dissertation? And in the end, it was a wonderful experience, and I really appreciated his viewpoints on different parts of my dissertation. And I wasn't one of his students, but as someone on my committee, he was always engaged with my research. And I really appreciated that even though I was an experimentalist mostly, he was always eager to share with me the fine points of the notation and the mathematics that he was interested in. I think he really enjoyed all of my experimental things that I brought to the research and my viewpoint on just my intuition of how the coherence theory and correlations really mattered. So I really appreciate all of his insight and things that he helped me with through my work at the University of Rochester. So thanks for that.
But the thing I really remember about Emil is when I first started in the late 90s to get interested in problems related to optical polarization. And I had a student, Kathleen Youngworth, who was beginning to work with me on this new idea of using a new kind of polarization state and devising ways of producing new polarizations out of laser beams. And she had done some experimental work and some calculations, and she was presenting her very first paper at the meetings of the Optical Society of America here in Rochester. And she was scheduled for an oral presentation. It was one of the last presentations of the conference. It was a huge room. Hardly anybody was there. And to make matters worse, the talk before hers was canceled. It was a no-show. And there's a rule with the Optical Society. If nobody shows up for a talk, you can't change the schedule. You have dead time. You have to wait until the next talk is scheduled to start. And so Kathleen was nervously up front, waiting and getting ready for her talk. I was there in the room, a huge room. Emil was there with his wife, Marlise, and a couple of Emil's current and former students, as well as one or two people from Rochester. And Kathleen was up front and nervous, and Emil came up to the front, and he started to chat with Kathleen, this most famous optical physicist in the world. And he came up to her and he said, he said, when Doppler gave his famous paper, there were only two people in the audience, and one of them was required to be there. And one of the two things that told me about Emil is that he had an appreciation for the history of optics, but it also showed his kindness for a student who was nervous, giving her very first talk to be compared to Doppler was just over the top. And it's that kindness that I most remember Emil for.
I finished my PhD in 1974, and then eventually through many events, I was coming as a professor to the Institute of Optics in 1989. So in January 1989, I came to the Institute of Optics and I wanted to meet Professor Wolf. But I didn't know how to proceed because in those days there was no email, and I thought I should make an appointment with him. So I was thinking about that, but then within a week, I heard a knock at my door. And who enters inside is Emil Wolf. He said, "Do you have a minute for me?" I said, "Sure." And he said, "You are my academic grandson. You know that?" I said, "I do know that." So he said, "I would like to invite you today for lunch at the faculty club. Would you like to come?" I said, "I will be more than happy to come." And I joined him at that time. And that started a time for a friendship that lasted for 30 years until this year. And he was very helpful all the time. I ended up working with him, wrote several papers together. And he was really the best mentor I can think of having.
And one thing I want to say is that I've learned from Emil that he has zero tolerance for discrimination. And there were people in the environment that kind of were sometimes not so nice to some students based on different cultures. And Emil was a fighter, and he would typically win those fights. And that's a very good thing.
So in many ways, Wolf really helped me. And I've always been grateful to him for that. And as a teacher, I eventually became a teacher at community college in California and taught physics. And I sort of used him as an example of how I wanted to interact with my students. So I learned a lot from him. And one thing that's amazed me being here is that to hear how many other people had the same kind of experience with Wolf. I knew that he did that, but and I've done it as a result to a few students. But now I find out it's like hundreds of students that he's done it for. And so I'm really touched by how much that he did for me and how much he's done for so many other students.
A few years later, when I was finishing 7th grade, my father talked to my sister and I about his plans to take a sabbatical from the university. His plan was to go to do some research and teach in Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada. My sister and I were going to spend a year studying in school in Canada. The problem for me was that 8th grade was a very important year in Rochester. We prepared, back then, we had New York State Regents exams that we had to take at the beginning of 9th grade, and so we spent a lot of time in 8th grade preparing for those exams. My father met with my teachers, and the teachers gave my father quite a bit of material and some practice exams to go over with me during the year we were away. I remember thinking at the time that I was doing very advanced math, trigonometry, things like that my father would try to help me with for a few weeks. I thought, give up and let me study at my own pace for the rest of the year. It seemed like it would be a very low stress year for me. Turns out my dad's pretty good in math. So he tutored me throughout the entire year. We went through all the test exams, finished them all. And then he produced many more test exams that he had apparently found when he was in the library collecting material for me before we left for Canada. We spent another few months going over the extra exams that he had found. And then he produced exams he made himself for me. It was probably the most difficult year of study of my life. When we got back in 9th grade, I took the New York State Regents exams. I did okay, my father was pleased. But for many years after that, he was very careful to remind me that it was because of him. He had a very good habit of taking credit for my successes, and the failures, of course, were my fault. I learned a lot about my father that year when we were away, though. There were no shortcuts with my dad. Everything had to be done the right way, the proper way. I also learned that when my father worked on something, he gave it everything he had. And I realized as the years went by that applied to a lot of things in his life. Not only studies and academics, but his relationships with people. He put everything he had into them, whether it was his colleagues, his students, his family, his friends, his children, and of course his beloved wife, Marlise. Tony and Amy came back to visit my father a few years ago. And I was talking with him, and I was saying that I was amazed that my father could have had so much success in his career, while my sister and I felt that he was very involved in our lives, and how could he have found the time to do both? And Amy thought for a minute. She said to me, nothing was going to stop him. And I thought that was very accurate. Nothing was going to stop him. So, thank you.